If we do not take action, climate is at the mercy of our economic growth. Right? So I think that's the direction. And at least for a company like Microsoft, I think we set our ambitions in 2020, around the same time when the Trump administration was coming to its tail end. So it's quite ironic in the sense that, we get asked this question again, whether, a company like Microsoft would, fall back on its ambitions. I think the short answer to that is no. I think we are committed to the ambitions which we have set. I think many of it are really what we call super ambitious climate objectives for ourselves. And we hope that by setting these objectives, that will trickle down to the ecosystem of partners we work with. Right? I think globally, we work with close to about 5,000 to 6,000 partners, and that's massive, right? So there's a lot of scrutiny on us from a reputational perspective and from a climate leadership perspective. So for us, I think we are committed to seeing through our goals in 2030.
Mm-hmm. We'll get back to corporations in a bit. I think it would be interesting to understand whether there is a difference between what you're doing specifically in Asia versus the rest of the world. But before we get to that, Seon, I want to call you into the discussion. Seon, you already had quite a complicated job, which was to communicate sustainability as it is. There are further layers of confusion and controversy, arguably, in today's world. As a science communicator, how do you navigate this, and how do you keep your audiences informed, engaged, and hopeful, really?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I think similar to what Kavikumar also said, when it comes, I don't think for me, these changes in what's happening around the world is going to simplify any of the environmental jargon that we're already using. And especially even in Asia, as much as people are no longer using certain terms like climate change, especially when it comes to these American-based companies, it doesn't deny the fact that that net zero targets and all these environmental targets still exist, and people still don't understand them anyway. So navigating the complexity remains. It remains just that now I feel you're just battling a different kind of perception on climate change, where people may suddenly feel like, okay, if this is no longer a priority, why do I want to learn about this when actually it doesn't really go away just because certain messaging might change. But it also presents, I feel, an interesting opportunity, because I think even in Asia, climate change as a topic doesn't quite stick or resonate with a lot of people. But language like resource protection, biodiversity conservation, resilience, still sticks. And those are the kinds of languages that we're seeing a lot more people adopt, even without saying the word climate change. So at the same time, I also see that these things are still equally difficult to navigate, but it highlights the intersections of climate and other issues that, as a communicator, you've always had to think about anyway.
It almost highlights the importance of having us sort of translating how these things. I mean, it has always been important for us to act as translators, but semantics matter more than ever now, it seems. And so I think communication and communicators might be of particular importance these days. Junice, I want to bring you to the discussion too. I want to understand from your perspective, how has Asia been responding to these shifts, and whether you are starting to see signs of hesitation in the form of delayed goals, softened targets, slowed action. What is your experience so far?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I mean, coming off from Qi and Kavik, I think media plays a somewhat challenging and job at this stage, because it's very easy to react to some of the recent news, especially around the tariffs, the reactions around it, the nervousness, from the stakeholders, etc. I think just yesterday, the big news, the shocker that came out, was how Southeast Asia has to deal with the tariff of about 3,521%. I mean, we don't usually go above 100% for any tariffs, but 3,521 is just ludicrous, right? So it's very easy for us to spin a story on media and take that as something that kind of evokes a very negative sentiment on the solar panel industry in particular for in this case. But I think from a sustainability media perspective, I think we had to very carefully manage, the I would say these kind of rapid fire news alongside the bigger trend, which I think is more important to cover. One of the things that we've noticed, of course, is how ESG, for example, is becoming a term that is very sensitive. Somebody even said that, you should look at your LinkedIn if you're in America and remove anything that's got to do with ESG because it sends a different sentiment, that sort of thing. And I think what we try to do is to cover that, but also to rationalize this against some of the bigger trends that I think my counterparts here are already talking about. And that is that a lot of these issues are going to remain anyway. Nature is nature and climate risk is going to be there. There was a very interesting interview that we covered with the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Maybank, one of the largest ASEAN banks around. Sharil is his name, and Sharil Azwa Jimin, he actually said, that, and scientists, if we don't do anything today, we're going to hit a 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That basically means a minus 37% of our GDP. Once you talk in numbers and value, right, monetary value, it immediately gets the banks and the financial institutions and the policymakers a little bit more riled up and a little bit more worried about the prospects of climate change becoming very real. And I think this is something that we as a media are finding ourselves having to balance, be very careful about the messaging, but also at the end of the day, stick very clearly to the fact that climate change is not going to go away with any new tariff that comes along.
Absolutely. I think this is the perfect timing, Ed, for us to bring up the results of the survey that we launched a few minutes ago. Can we see the results now, Ed? Do you mind putting them on the screen or sharing with us which was the... Right. Yeah, I had a bit of a bet on this one. So I think the majority of us think progress will be uneven. Some countries will lead, others will lag behind. I guess I would want to go around the virtual table now and ask your thoughts on this. Kavik, let's maybe start with you. Are you aligned with this perspective?
Yeah, I sort of figured that this would be the response, but wasn't quite sure that the overwhelming response would be that progress will be uneven. And I think that would be the direction, right? I mean, generally, this whole aspect of climate advocacy and sustainability has been increasingly used as a strategic compete factor, right? I mean, we've seen the case in Europe where, the onset of regulation has made, Europe a leader in that space, right? So I think within Southeast Asia or even in Asia, I guess it will be based on differing priorities. I mean, some of these countries are pursuing economic growth, while others have other issues to really deal with, right? So those who see value in this and seize the opportunity will definitely see value in the long term, I believe.
Sion, views?
I would say that at least in Asia, I guess when you're talking about priorities, right? It's tricky because I don't see things changing, especially when opportunities wise, people are still there are still certain beliefs and priorities that don't go away, especially now when the economy is not doing the best. So I would even, say that talking about anything like climate can come across as very privileged, which also requires us to change the way that we talk about issues from a cost of living lens, and especially in this region, disaster relief and recovery, and erratic weather. So I think when it comes to even trying to be anything more of a leader is always tricky for me because I don't know how. I don't see that, not because I don't think there is an opportunity, but I just don't see that being a pressing priority, even now as we see different countries take to the election polls. Climate is always never top on the list, which suggests to me that the communities are concerned about other things, and it's up to us as communicators to figure out what are the key things that are affecting people. And especially in this region, when communicating about climate and seeing how things progress, we might see certain things as progress, like increasing renewable, but when this comes at a cost of local communities, which happens quite frequently, I don't know whether I call that progress, especially when it's still exploitative, especially in places like, let's say, the Philippines, which comes up quite a fair bit. So for me, it's almost like, how do we then balance this when people say, oh, this is progress, we're leading in renewables, we're doing all these things, but it comes at the cost of people and also the planet to some extent, which is such a big difficulty when talking about climate in this space, because it almost, as communicators, sometimes you almost come across as hypocritical, saying that some of these green things are not that green after all. So I do struggle with that.
Janice, perspectives.
I reflect on Xiyun's points, and I definitely can empathize with this whole conundrum that we face, especially in this part of the world, because you are very easily caught up, to be hypocritical or double standards, that sort of thing. I think maybe perhaps because I sit in China, and where I see in China, there's actually, interestingly enough, a sense of positivity in that sense. And I think one of the things that I have to maybe, and I'll talk about China maybe later on, but one of the things I think I've noticed about the country is that they've been on this growth of decarbonization for a very long time. They built their own EV industry not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, it was 30, 40 years ago. So one of the things that you notice about an economy and civilization so large is that, when the big ship turns, they don't exactly change directions so quickly in that sense. And I think a lot of these headwinds we're feeling might be seen as little bumps on the road, but the general direction of how this whole thing is going is pretty much consistent. And it's consistent to what we got the news of, which is that we're going to transition away from fossil fuels, and we're going to transition away from the dirty industry into something that's cleaner for the environment, because it is a new business model that the world is becoming quite acquainted with as well. And one of the things in that whole buy-in are actually the financial institutions. These financial institutions are also the ones that are influencing a lot of power, a lot of investment money, trillions of dollars going into something that will eventually not just decarbonize, but they will grow new industries as well, new economies. And this sort of direction is not going to change anytime soon, because they've already made these investments, some time back, and now they just have to see through a lot of these plans. So I think as much as we get affected by these kind of news, I think we have to stay the course and be quite I guess convinced that we believe that is all happening. One example on this is actually the regional ASEAN power grid. I think a lot of us that are in this space is watching that very closely, because the biggest challenge we have in bringing down our carbon emissions is that we don't have a grid that gets around our region where we can trade energy sources easily, and that makes our power in Singapore, for example, very expensive versus another place like, say, Vietnam, which is far cheaper, but maybe you have less standards, that sort of thing. A regional power grid is something ASEAN has been developing for some time, but you can't exactly have that switched on, in a flit of a button or an overnight sort of thing. It's going to take decades before we all get that. But now the subsea cables are being laid, and these energy storage systems are being built, and money is being spent in the billions to make that happen. So I think we will realize a lot of that. We just have to kind of stick with it and see through it.
Maybe let's stay with you, Janice. I know this question was coming a little bit later, but maybe let's stick with you and let's dive a little bit deeper into China. You are currently in China. I think we are all familiar with the amazing progress that China has done in terms of renewables, in terms of electrical vehicles. Do you think there's a role for China to play in this sort of vacuum in global climate leadership, and how are they communicating it? If they do want this, what are they doing a good job at communicating it?
So two-part answers to that. A very good question of yours. So number one, China, is it going to fill that vacuum? I think whether it likes it or not, it has to some extent, but there's of course a lot of work to be done. That said, the second part of your question about how they're communicating it, I think that's the part that they're doing a pretty shoddy job at. And no insult to China. I think, the truth is, the country itself is large enough that a lot of things happen, and however you want to paint the story, it's very much led from the top, right? It's led from the Communist Party, however you want to, call it in that sense, the government in that sense. And the way they communicate this is through their 5-year plan. If you see their 5-year plan, you understand the messaging. It's very clear what China wants to do. The big news that came out yesterday, which I think, some of us should pay very close attention to, is how the top guy in the job, which is President Xi Jinping, has announced that, they will, sort of release their nationally determined contributions for all greenhouse gas emissions across all economic sectors sometime later this year. It might not mean much, but in simplest terms, and I'm sure Tien can do a better job than me, it just basically means that China is going to walk the talk. It's talked about it, some time ago, but there were a lot of questions about their plans, their ambitions, and a lot of people started poking holes into it. But what China's trying to do is lay the cards out for you and to tell you how they're going to get to 2035. Now they're peaking in 2025. The next 10 years is going to really just show you how they're going to actively decarbonize in a way that is going to really make a mark, globally speaking, from a greenhouse gas emissions standpoint. And maybe just to say that one thing about China that I've also realized over time, they speak in sometimes circular terms. You maybe have to read between the lines in what they're saying, but what they're trying to communicate is that they need to work with everyone else to do that. They realize they're not the only ones on board. They can only do that much, which is kind of true, but they also recognize that transition is required, which means they're going to bring their entire people along as well, and they would love ASEAN to be on that journey. The truth is, China works very differently from the rest of the world. So how it's going to do that with its regional neighbors, I think you have to tread that very, very carefully. And at the moment, I think it's not so smooth sailing yet.
Super interesting. Tune, let's focus on you and a little bit on your experience with Asian audiences. You have a platform that touches many countries, a lot of audiences here in this side of the world. What do people tend to be particularly interested when they access your platform? Are there any topics inside sustainability that sort of come out more than others? And do you see differences between the countries in Asia? Are some countries, for example, I don't know, Singapore, more active in this space than others?
No, it's so interesting that you bring that up, because for me, my platform, 60% of my audience are based in Asia, and this includes the Asia Pacific region. And something that I notice is that it's always hard for me to say what resonates with such a diverse audience. But I know that, let's say in particular, things that are evergreen are always explainers of extremely technical things like COP29 and acronyms like the NCQG, all those things that everyone is paying attention to. That continues to be something that people are concerned about. But particularly in Asia, I would say that I think actually Singapore, in terms of communicating it, I think there's a lot of, if I'm looking at the way that different organizations, nonprofits are communicating climate, I don't even think that Singapore is like top on the list on the people that are creating all this content. Civil society in Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines are so good at it and so active. Also because a lot of their grassroots organizations are constantly responding to emergency relief situations, typhoons. So I would even say that I think in terms of awareness, a lot of those conversations around weather patterns comes up a lot in conversation, and always is my highest performing post about the weather, about the heat, about the haze, about the rain, because our region feels the impact of that. And I think now you see it more viscerally when communities and more people are evacuating from their homes. And I don't think this is very different from other people, even in South America, in the Middle East, where all of these things happen. But I would say that I think in Asia, one thing that for me as a communicator that I am still struggling to do is also communicating this information in local languages. Even in Singapore, having this translated into Chinese, into Malay, into and any other languages seems to be an issue, because all this information is still very much predominantly in English, and there's been a lot of interest about translating it into Thai, into Tagalog, because most of the people in those who need this information don't speak English. And I think that's the biggest challenge for, at least for Asia, especially when communicating some of these things requires me to now think about, okay, how do we get this to the people who actually need it, besides those who are privileged enough to understand English?
That's a really good point. We always think in English, but of course, sometimes it doesn't resonate with local communities. There is also one thing you said about communities that are more exposed to climate change tending to be more interested in topics related, obviously, to climate change. And we see the same with the patterns on buying sustainability. There was a recent study that highlighted exactly that very often are the communities that are more exposed to climate change that are more eager to contribute to buying sustainable. So exposure does drive behavior. Kavik, over to you. We spoke a little bit about corporations a while back, and you explained how you thought corporations were reacting. I wanted to check with you whether you think there are different perspectives in corporations in Asia, either domiciled companies in Asia or companies that have a strong presence in Asia. Do you think that when you go out and communicate about sustainability, do you communicate the same way across the world, or are you a little bit more, I guess, overt in Asia and less overt in other sides of the world? Wanted to take your perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point. And generally, I think our approach has been sort of a one size fits all, right? Which means when we communicate something, we communicate it consistently across the board. I think the challenge and opportunity with Asia is that the level of literacy might not be as similar or profound as what we see in the Americas or Europe, right? So uh, there's a very bunch where within the Asian corporates you have those on the higher pedestal and those on a mid tier to the lower pedestal in terms of interest on these issues, right? So those who are on the upper quartile per se are just generally very interested in these issues, very engaging, broaching the topic further, and also more importantly, seeing how they can exhibit some sort of leadership in this space, right? In how they communicate, how they can sort of also showcase what they are doing in terms of their ambitions and their implementation around sustainability. So I think generally with what's happened so far is that there's still the belief that the East should take some sort of directional or leadership guidance from the West when it comes to sustainability, right? So it's like a wait and see approach, or sometimes what we call the Brussels effect, right? So what happens in the EU, America, sort of trickles down to this part of the world. So there's some sort of what we call, I would say, a cautious optimism on how to approach this. And I think within Asian firms, I don't think anything has changed dramatically or massively. So nothing has rocked the boat. So I think it's a bit more status quo. But in terms of communicating or being really loud, I think there's a bit of caution in how they do it. So just really mindful of what they put out and who they communicate that to, the audience and stuff like that. So I think that's the only change we see. So there's nothing that has been massive, but there's of course some belief that Asia can use this opportunity to sort of close the gap between the other regions when it comes to these issues. So I think that's the general sentiment I see on the ground at least.
Do semantics matter? To our point earlier on, do words matter when it comes to sustainability, corporate sustainability?
Absolutely. I think even when you talk to some of these corporates, depending where they are, I think the semantics matter, right? I mean, if you talk at Asia Pacific general, I mean, you have to be quite mindful about the nuances in the language you use. For example, if you're communicating to someone in Japan, I think there's a bit of ask for details, right? Very detail oriented sort of things, trying to get to the crux of the issue. And I think you need to be a bit more balanced there. Whereas in other regions, for example, if you work out for India, which is really, really very ambitious when you talk about climate, I think they are seeing this opportunity as a space to sort of also exhibit leadership. And they're quite vocal about it, right? Especially the Modi government. So I think in those markets, it's about, presenting the broad opportunities, when it comes to climate and how, India can sort of leverage that. So it really depends on the tone and how you go about. So I think the semantics matter in these markets for sure, because of the varying levels of maturity, interest in the space and how they envision going about what they intend to do.
Thank you. Junice, I'll move to you now. And let's start focusing a little bit more on us and our role as communication professionals. I have a 3-in-1 for you, so 3-part question. Let's start with how you see the role of media, right? In an era, how do you make sure that media continues to place attention in sustainability and make it top of mind? But also, how do you do that in a balanced way, right? Whilst you continue to hold companies accountable, but do it also in an uplifting and solutions-oriented way. And finally, do you think the way we are communicating sustainability in Asia needs to differentiate from the rest of the world? Going back to this conversation around semantics. So how do you make it a priority? How do you balance making it accountable and constructive? And is it different communicating here in Asia versus the rest of the world?
Such a loaded.
I know, it's a little bit loaded. Take it in parts. I can also wait for it.
No
Just
worries.
the first one and then we go.
Okay. I think journalists at heart, they live to tell the story, through the facts. I think this is something that they hold very clear, very dear to their hearts. And, it's all about integrity when it comes to journalism, right? And I think this is why people still read news today, wherever you are on social media. You do want to subscribe to the platforms that you trust in that sense. So I think that trust has to be earned, and it's tough actually for a niche media like ours. We're not a New York Times, we're not a Straits Times or anything like that. So we're not a mainstream media. The challenge, of course, with that is that the mainstream media has a job to, I guess, get everyone maybe to be aware of some of these topics that about climate change or maybe poverty alleviation or even climate tech, that sort of thing. But the moment we cross into maybe, say, the use of hydrogen, then it gets very, very clunky for many people, and they don't really know why we're talking about ammonia or carbon capture, that sort of thing. And I think our job as a communicator is to really cut through the clutter and make it make sense for someone. If I'm going to talk about carbon capture, explain in a way where you're trying to say you're going to remove carbon from the atmosphere. How? Well, let me explain how that works, sort of thing. A little bit like explaining to a 7-year-old. I think that the fundamentals of that still exist very much, today. I think the challenge, of course, is balancing the needs of the full narrative. So there's one which is profit versus the issues at play. The second one, of course, is environmental pursuit in the expense of, say, social aspects. So you might be pursuing something around the environmental space, but then you're giving up a lot on, say, the livelihoods of people in a particular region or indigenous area as well. So there are a lot of these trade-offs that I think need to be explained better, and we have not done a good job at all. If anything, journalism, what we do try to do is to explain those nuances. But then who has time to read it? Who has time to read through a 5-minute, kind of essay, and we're not even talking 5 minutes. Sometimes you have to do a 10-minute piece to explain something. So, but then, that's Chi Yun's job, right? I would say is to really try to explain that it's never quite black or white. It's very, very gray. And I think this is where we have to try to get more communicators to think how we can simply explain these nuances in a better way. One of the things we've noticed in terms of trend is this whole green hushing situation in Asia. Now, switching to your third question, a lot of Asian companies today would rather have no commitment or say nothing rather than to even have a soft commitment. Now, this is understandable because it's better to kind of lie low and kind of just not talk about it rather than to say some and then not very sure whether or not you can withstand the accusations or whatever backlash that you might get. This is definitely a trend in this part of the world, and we haven't quite cracked how we can encourage more Asian companies to rise above that I guess that window or that cover, and to say, what, just communicate clearly what you have been doing. You can stick to the facts, but don't hush yourselves. Don't shy away from what you have been doing so well on, because to be honest, that would protect you when things go bad in that sense. This part, I think I don't have a solution for. I think the Asian companies would just need to come out a little bit more and maybe perhaps hire more communicators to do that in a more sophisticated, maybe a little bit more, I guess more meaningful manner. And I'm sure my colleagues here would be able to expound more on that.
I also have a follow-up question on what you said. Do you think that we all need to get a little bit more comfortable with conversations around progress rather than outcomes, or to the fact that not all solutions when it comes to sustainability are probably going to be perfect solutions, to Tion's point earlier on? I would love to have your views on that.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, actually. One of the things, because I do a lot of trainings to boards and senior management, etc., and one of the things I try to tell them is if you're going to communicate a sustainability report, for example, don't tell them that you've done all these amazing things. We might believe some of it, but after a while, you know, all the green lights everywhere might show that, you know, you start to dig for the not so great stuff. So when it comes to things like a sustainability report or a fact sheet whatsoever, it's actually totally okay to show the green stuff, the amber stuff, and the parts that are maybe red that you know are problematic, and you explain what you're going to do about it to fix those things because you are aware that you are facing problems there. It is much better than to show everything, you know, as having been fine and dandy the last few years and not talk about some of the challenges you face. So that balance and clarity is really very, very critical. And actually the main frameworks out there, the global reporting standards or IFRS, those sort of things, they are encouraging that sort of balanced communication. But I think a lot of companies, especially in Asia, are very uncomfortable with sharing the not so great news. We need to do it in a much more factual and meaningful light. Yeah.
Really good points. Tune, over to you. As you said, you raised this point a little bit earlier in our discussion. It's tough out there, right? You know, people are struggling to make ends meet these days. There's a lot of competing priorities for a lot of consumers. So how do we continue to make sustainability relevant, considering that people just have other priorities these days?
Yeah. I feel that in terms of competing priorities, I would say that sustainability, even as it gained prominence, hasn't always been the easiest thing to keep top of mind for even for management of the most progressive companies, I would assume. And I would love if Kavik Kumar, you can tell me whether that rings true. But for me, when thinking about communicating sustainability, especially as a content creator, there are three things that I keep a watch for. So the first one is just understanding nuance of an Asian audience. And I share this because there was a period of time where TikTok in particular was trying to push a more education angle in Asia among creators, where they wanted more people to create educational content. And I'm not sure how well that has done, but you know, as someone who's also very in tune with what international creators are doing, I know that, you know, hashtag climate talk or all those very political explainers do very well in the United States and in Europe, but don't go particularly well. They're not as viral in Asia, where Asian audiences still use TikTok and Instagram for comedy, lifestyle, and travel recommendations. And understanding that also made me think about how educational information just needs to be more creatively disguised as something else, because this is an audience where they don't want to read all this gloomy stuff because they're so preoccupied with everything else. They want to be entertained. And there's so many creators who do this very well in Asia. So to me, trying to find ways to disguise sustainability messaging in other things and timing that messaging. For example, in July, you know that it's very hot in Singapore. And in Asia, in particular, because of the inter-monsoon season, then that's when I time all my stuff around heat, because I know that my friends are complaining about it on their Instagram stories. So having to really be a little bit more strategic on when I put things out has become top of mind for me, to make sure that it is top of mind for my friends, because they're always asking me, why is it so hot? Why is it raining so much? Should I go for whatever? And things like that. The second thing is that, you know, I know we talk a lot about having to make this information simple for people, but I also, you know, when communicating this, to make it relevant is not to oversimplify a lot of the sustainability content. And how I justify that is, if my friends can go down very weird internet rabbit holes about very specific things like skincare or stocks and Bitcoin, like, why can't you do the same for science? So I like to think that when creating content, it's also just creating all these interesting nuggets that people can show off across dinner tables, because sustainability content is complex and it needs to be treated in that way. So I feel that that just keeps sustainability as something that people are curious about rather than, you know, scared of. And the last thing about being scary is that I like to mix a bit more joy when I talk about sustainability. And that's something that I want to link back to my first point about lifestyle, right? A lot more people might be more keen for to watch me do a video on places that I go thrifting in Malaysia, in Australia, and then sneak in a comment about overconsumption, improper waste disposal, holding companies accountable. Those kind of content do a bit better because they feel like they're not being scolded or reprimanded for something that they're not doing. So having to find ways where, like, let's say if I talk about vegetarian food, which might not sit well with a lot of people, I would have to think about how do I get people excited about this dish rather than you should go plant-based, blah, 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 because no one wants to be told off on the internet. So I think doing those ways, people still want to be entertained, even if they're struggling to make ends meet or if they have other priorities, and trying to meet them where they're at is something that I think about a lot to make sure sustainability is still relevant.
I think those are such good points. I subscribe everything you said. I think it's not about oversimplifying. It's about normalizing it and making sure that it's part of culture and it's embedded on our day-to-day. And then it becomes much easier to understand and to connect with. The more far away we talk about sustainability, the more we make it niche, the harder I think it's to connect. Kavik, let's touch a little bit more on corporate communication. Now, equally competing business priorities for corporations, shifting regulations, also applying quite a bit of pressure here. How do we make sure that sustainability remains top of mind for the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a $1 million question, and I wish I did full justice by answering the question, but let me attempt to. I think it's always been a back against the wall exercise, to be honest. I mean, having worked in multiple corporations and and in my current corporation as well, I think it's always a challenge to get sustainability very, very mainstream, which means it is there. But I think we are probably one of the few companies where we have strong governance around sustainability and sustainability implementation and outcomes, right? So I think I'll give credit for the management to really putting the action to talk, right? I think that's where the value has been for us. And I won't be able to say the same for other companies. I worked in organizations where it was so difficult to get sustainability, as even a conversation starter, right? So, and given the current climate, there's the work that was hard has become even harder, right? Because of what's happened geopolitically, and for you to convince your management and C-suite leaders that there is value on this will be very much a long haul compared to what it was previously. But having said that, I think there's always light at the end of the tunnel, and I think one of the best ways to go about that is just being authentic, right? I mean, being authentic is very important, very authentically communicating what is in it for the organization and where it would move or shift should we embark on that journey and embrace this strong. And I think that's very important. And I think as long as you are able to continually articulate that value proposition to your leadership, I think that's very important. And it's also critical to latch on key critical developments in the space to really communicate your ideas through, right? For example, if you have the IPCC report, or probably if the next COP happens, use that as an opportunity to really get conversations going within your organization, because that's where there's a lot of chatter, there's a lot of coverage on these events, and get that into mainstream discussion with your management. And I think secondly is also about using what we call the strategic compete factor, right? So always just oppose yourself with your competitors to showcase what your competitors are doing, right? So sometimes, I mean, very transparently, some of the exercises we do in our organization is, hey, look at the headcount that Google and Amazon has on sustainability and communications, right? So that's the amount of budget they've allocated for these sort of roles. So shouldn't we be doing the same, right? So that sort of data speaks to management, and that's where the light bulb moments comes, and they take it a bit more seriously, because then you start thinking of it as a compete factor, right? So I think all this is going to be important in the longer run, but I think it requires a lot of patience, and I think you really need to stick to your guns from day one to get the messaging across the board and really seize the right opportunities to really amplify what you communicate. And I think the last point that I want to double click on, which you mentioned, was just about communication in a very simplistic manner. For corporations, if you communicate too simplistically, you also run the risk of, greenwashing, for instance, right, where you give very little detail on what your goal or ambition is or how you're going to move towards that, right? So that fine balance is super crucial. If not, then you open up a can of worms, and you end up in a situation where you need to, basically, answer questions that you don't want to eventually. So it's about striking that balance between simplification and oversimplification.
Kavik, let's stay with you. I'm going to start opening questions or taking questions from the audience. There's one here that I think is really fitting to what you just said, and maybe you can expand a little bit more. How important is internal communications in what comes to communicating sustainability, and I guess continuing to rally the C-suite on these matters?
Absolutely. I think internal communication is super important. I think at least in Microsoft, we do that very proactively. We have numerous self-interest groups. We have folks who are really super interested in these topics, but are working in different functions, right? So they take up the mantle to really rally conversations around this. And when you communicate internally, that's where you build more cadence with the employee base. You really permeate the messaging across the board. And more importantly, you build a sense of, ownership on that issue, right? And in our organization, leadership supports that sort of communication. So we have numerous groups communicating this across various platforms, and I think that really helps to build the narrative, and that really helps leadership to see how much buy-in that the employee base has on sustainability, and that also gives them a directional sense of approach towards the longer term and how they should be tactically for the organization and its.
Makes sense. Junis, I'm gonna take this question or offer you this question. It's from Pranav. What gives you hope that sustainability storytelling can still drive impact and real change, especially in this age of polarization and disinformation? Are there any clear and obvious wins that you've seen from your work recently that give you hope?
If I may just answer, maybe just one point on Kavik's last point before I answer this one, I thought was helpful is regarding helping people to understand what is being done in the company. We recently have been working with a large financial institution who set a net zero ambition. Now, a lot of companies now have set lots of net zero ambitions, and they always do this net zero by 2050 thing. To be honest, it does sound like not much, right? I mean, it is only a one-liner, but actually there's a lot of implications to what that means for the organization, because it basically means they need to have zero emissions, net zero emissions by in a couple of years' time, 25 years' time. Is not easy to do, especially because you've got to still make profits and operationalize your entire your company in that sense. That sort of thing requires a company to get their staff strength to understand what exactly needs to be done. And I think one of the things we've been doing with this financial institution is to train up their project managers, their sales teams, etc., to explain what exactly the bank is going to do to ensure net zero is going to happen. Then it opens up a whole bunch of questions that their staff are even asking, because they then want to get skilled up on what they need to be done for the bank to achieve those things. And I think it will help Kavik's job. It will help everybody, including the board, etc., to get to where they want to be when everybody is on board. So you cannot underestimate how much it requires for everyone down the line as well to get buy-in in that sense. To that question by Pranav on storytelling and making impact and change. It is very difficult, though, to be honest, because I think a lot of them are still on that journey, especially in polarization, disinformation. So true. One of the examples I think comes to mind is what Apple has been doing. And I do like to follow what Apple's doing simply because they are very clever with their communications, very innovative. Everybody watches them. Everybody knows their brand, etc. And one of the recent ads that came out about 2 years ago, I'm sure some of you would have seen it. It was the one where Tim Cook was in as well, where they talked about Mother Nature, right? Coming in and sort of doing a test on how they've been doing, and it was like a 10 a.m. appointment sort of thing. And then she went through the stats, how's your water, how's your transport and logistics, etc., your everything around the operations, right? And all of them were quizzed. It was very funny because anyone who's doing communications would know how sorry, how difficult it is to communicate all these boring things to some extent in a meaningful way. And it was so funny to watch that, right? But so I thought it was very well done because it really stuck to the hearts of a lot of us who are doing communications and sustainability. Where they kind of didn't do so well, interestingly, if you read the backstory on this, was that they didn't share these commitments with their suppliers actually before they launched this ad. So they didn't check through on whether or not these things they were going to do around net zero was actually implementable, but with their suppliers around the world. And their suppliers were actually really upset because they realized how difficult it would be later on to help them to realize this ambition, you know. So on the one hand, I think Apple does a very good job on circularity. If you watch some of their videos around the Daisy's arm that cracks open their phone to, you know, to recycle all the stuff, it's amazing because you can communicate all of these things so well. But at the same time, you know, they can do better internally as well. And I think internally would mean the entire value chain that probably was not informed about some of the things they're doing. So yeah, some examples there.
No, that's definitely a milestone on when it comes to communicating sustainability. Tiyun, I have a question from you from Lynn. Tiyun, you spoke about the kind of content that audiences are more engaged in, weather explainers, etc. How can we better engage audience to use their voice and choice to rally policymakers in the private sector, brands, and big organizations to make faster progress?
Oh, this one is so difficult, especially when thinking about communications as an advocacy tool, which is super important. And I actually love to hear what people, especially in the communication space, have to say about this. But for me, there's just so many things to advocate for when it comes to rallying policymakers and the private sector. I remember during the time of the haze, I think this was before the one in 2019, when that happened, it was very easy to gather people and to tap on their emotions at that point in time to say, okay, you know, ban like paper products, etc. I remember supermarkets not stocking paper products for a while because of its contributions to the haze. In Singapore, at least, you know, trying to get people to think about all these issues is very difficult because they get fatigued, especially when for something like environmental impact assessments, if there are forests being cut down every few months, it's hard to bring that momentum up, get them to do something with policymakers, and then that disappears, and then call them to do that. And then 2 weeks later, something about plastic, 3 weeks later, something about net zero. It's just so exhausting, even as an activist, to be like, oh my gosh, how many of these things do we have to fight for? Because there's not enough of us, and that individual who cares will feel very overwhelmed, especially when each one of these things have so much to research on before even knowing what to say. So I would say that the best way to engage these audiences to use their voice is, I hate to use this term, but it's almost like how people prepare for election season, right? You have the 5 years to prepare the ground before you utilize them at a very specific moment. And that's the same with advocacy, where a lot of our education work is not just for awareness, but it's so that we build an informed enough citizenry such that when we need to call upon it, it's there. We're not having to educate them from scratch. And I see that as particularly useful unfortunately, whenever there's a controversy, or let's say in Singapore, when it's the cross island line or certain brands being dubbed as greenwashing, it's very easy to pull the anger, the passion, to get them to rally policymakers, or during like rallies, like the climate rallies or Earth Day, to make faster progress, because then we have a big concentration of voices who are very willing to step outside of their comfort zone to say, I'm going to write to my representative, or I'm going to write to a brand about this. So that education work is just like us chipping away at these people's consciousness, just so that when there's a strategic time for us to launch a campaign, that can gather enough steam. Yeah.
Which applies really well to, I mean, communication strategies in terms of stakeholder management, right? We do that a lot as communication professionals in terms of mapping the stakeholders and really having ongoing conversations with them until and if the day comes in which we need to engage with them. So it's almost applying that to the consumer. I have one more question. Kavik, maybe bring you also to the conversation. There's a very good question here in terms of money versus sustainability, right? How much responsibility can we fairly put on businesses when the economy is not supportive of business performance in the first place? Do you have any views on this from Microsoft and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, just rereading the question again. So if I read it right, it says, basically putting money where we need to, right? So generally, I think it's going to be a tricky situation, right? Again, it's very much dependent on what the values the corporation holds itself towards and what its client customer base is seeking for, right? I think that's very important. And of course, you also need to take into consideration the prevailing economic climate, which is very important. So I think it's always a balance, right? And I can't say that that balance is always there for all companies. I think you need to be operating at a certain scale. You need to have a certain level of sustainability leadership to sort of exhibit that. But I think many firms struggle with this, where it's always money and profitability first before sustainability, right? So I think that's the conundrum. And as long as shareholders are still very much fixated on share price and what the sort of dividends to get at the end of each AGM, I think it's sort of hard to shift the needle, right? So that's why it's so hard for businesses and even sustainability communicators and professionals to really get this very, very mainstream. Because if something has to give, I think sustainability would be the first element to sort of drop off from the list. Should we progress and should we seek more profit generating outcomes for the business, right? So I think it's going to be tricky, but I mean, as much as corporations try to balance this, there's always something that needs to give, and usually sustainability is the one, and the business needs are the first to be really taken care of. So really dependent on the organization, but I don't think there are many organizations out there who can balance this needs very adequately and equally, right? So that's my view on this.
Eventually, there's also a role to play in terms of demonstrating the impacts, the potential negative impacts of not taking care of sustainability, even when there are other pressing priorities, right? Because there are several scenarios that can be brought into play to demonstrate, what sort of risks company carry if they don't look at it.
Absolutely. And there are some companies who are happy to pay for it, not complying to certain things because they feel that to invest in something is not really worthwhile in the longer term, and they do the cost benefit analysis and they realize that, all right, if we're not complying to this or we're not doing this, is fine. Let's just pay our way through it. So there are some companies who do that as well in the broader scheme of things. And typically when things really come to the boil and they realize that they need to take action, that's when the money is shifted to sustainability to really focus on it. But if it's not the case, then it's mostly focused on spending to meet compliance needs, and generally that's the case, right? Nothing above and sort of beyond. Yeah.
If I could just very quickly jump on that point on money as well, it's very, very critical. Sorry, if I may. I'll give you an example of a Singapore company that that actually has done very well to handle this situation. They sell a product that is not part of a B2C product, a B2B product, and they do they supply to governments to build bridges, etc. So not exactly a sexy product. But what they did, and because they're listed, they had no choice but to comply anyway. So this whole time it's been just shut down their necks, and they have to go and just do reporting just like any other Singapore listed company. But then the CEO and the chief financial officer actually realized that what if we tried to find a way around this by making this a business case such that we can maybe win more deals with the government if we had a sustainability positioning. But in order to do that, they realized they needed to do what they call a life cycle assessment on one of their product lines that they were selling. This life cycle assessment basically allows them, it kind of gives them a lot of street cred, a lot of credibility, because it's been scientifically calculated how much emissions it takes to produce this entire thing all the way down to when you dispose of it. So very, very complex, but not a cheap thing. But then it decided, it's worth doing it. Let's do it for one or two of our key products, and then see what happens. And then after they got that done, they realized that they were starting to, bid for bigger projects. And not only that, then they decided, let's start communicating our life cycle assessment that we did, because then maybe our customers will start to notice that we have been doing that. So in that route, you can see that they have now been creating that business case to win things that they would never have imagined, if not for the fact that, we need to start just making more money, doing more business with, folks that we never did before. And then eventually they started to sell to the whole EV space. They started to sell to the data center space, whom they've never supplied to before, because they realized their product could be augmented to suit those markets as well. So another nice, great case study of a company, not so large, but it's really starting to see that we can have a unique selling point if we start to maybe creatively think about it. Yeah.
I think this is an excellent way for us to wrap up. Thank you, Jonas, for this example. I think it's an excellent example of using sustainability as a competitive advantage. I would love very much to thank you for joining us today for such a thoughtful and energizing conversation. I hope we are all leaving with new ideas, with fresh perspectives, and most importantly, a renewed sense of purpose in how we communicate sustainability. As we've heard across the board, our role as communicators is more important than ever, and the actions we take, whether they're big or small, can really help keep sustainability at the top of the agenda. So let's keep the momentum going. Until next time, take care, and a big thank you to everyone.